They refused to hire me because I was Black, but then the CEO found out. The email arrived just after sunrise, the subject line crisp and impossible to ignore. I read it at the kitchen table while my coffee cooled untouched, lips forming the words out loud just to be sure they were real. An invitation to interview for a role I had studied and wanted for years, a title I had carried around like a talisman. The company was one I admired, with campaigns I could recite and a mission that felt modern and human. I thought of a younger version of myself who scribbled dreams on sticky notes, and I told that past self we were finally stepping into a room we had imagined so many times. I smiled into the quiet and let myself feel the way hope can make everything glow a little brighter. Preparing felt like a ritual. I ironed the shirt until the seams looked like a promise. I slipped my portfolio into a leather sleeve and checked the corners of each print until I was sure there were no dog ears, no smudges, nothing out of place. I reviewed the company site again, memorizing the language of their values and the cadence of their voice. I watched a video of the CEO giving a talk about curiosity and courage in the face of change, and I thought, yes, I can breathe in that world. I practiced answers in the mirror, trying to catch the places where my mouth worked faster than my breath. When a friend called to wish me luck, I told them I felt ready, like every late night and every hard lesson had lined up in a row behind me, shoulders squared, waiting. The building rose out of the sidewalk with glass that caught the sky. Inside the lobby, the air was cool and slept in a citrus and coffee scent. The receptionist greeted me with a polished smile and tapped the keyboard so lightly I barely heard it. I offered my name and the time, and she nodded, eyes flicking to my suit, my shoes, my hair, then back to the screen. People drifted through the space in quiet conversations, badges swinging at their hips, laughter that popped and then disappeared. I watched the elevator doors close and open, small stages for small performances. In the waiting area, I took a seat near a planter and reviewed my notes while trying to make time slow down. On the wall behind me, framed posters declared phrases about culture and fit and the magic of teams. There were glossy photos of company gatherings in open fields and sunlit rooftops, long tables full of people leaning toward each other like old friends. A recruiter approached with a quick step and a brief smile, the kind that skimmed the surface and kept moving. The handshake was more a touch than a press, and the eyes did that quick scan that felt like a measuring tape pulled around my shoulders. We sat in a small conference room with glass walls that made me feel like a fish on display. She asked me to walk through my resume and explain a few career pivots, which I did with the kind of practiced clarity that comes from having told your own story so many times. She nodded along, but her questions darted sideways sometimes. Could I describe my personal style and how I would adapt it for clients who prefer a classic look? Was I comfortable in environments that skewed traditional? The words were soft, but I could hear the edge beneath them. Culture fit came up again, not as a value, but as a filter. Another interviewer joined, a manager with a neat smile that never reached the eyes. The chair creaked as they leaned back, arms folded in a way that made the room feel a little cooler. They asked about a project where I had been the only person willing to push for a different approach. I told the story and felt their attention pinging between my face and the door, as if part of them were already elsewhere. They commented on my voice, how it was calm and articulate, and how important it would be for our clients to feel at ease. Then a pause, and a question about whether I had ever found myself in rooms where my background made me stand out, and how I navigated that dynamic. I answered honestly and with care, because I knew what I was hearing, and I had learned how to respond without giving away the sting. There were moments of warmth, too. A director laughed when I described an early career mistake and what it taught me about humility and grit. We talked briefly about a campaign that had moved me, and for a heartbeat, the conversation felt like a lively walk down a familiar street. Then the warmth cooled. The director leaned forward and asked about where I lived, what neighborhood, and whether the commute would be a strain for someone like me. The words sat there between us. I looked at the glass wall, the ghost of my reflection superimposed on the hall. I answered that I was comfortable with the commute and that my work would show up fully no matter the distance. Another question drifted in about weekend routines and if I enjoyed the kinds of social events the team held. The examples offered sounded like a quiet test. Country clubs, rustic retreats, holiday parties at venues that required a certain attire. I nodded and said I could be a chameleon when the occasion called for it, that my focus was on the work and on building trust. A small muscle jumped in the interviewer's cheek. a tell I was not meant to notice. They smiled again, and it looked tired. When they asked to see my portfolio, I opened it with a little swell of pride. I pointed to case studies that had metrics in plain view, to creative choices with logic behind them. One of them flipped through the pages as if the paper were heavy, barely pausing. The other asked about conflict resolution in teams and whether I had ever had to coach someone on tone. I answered with examples about listening and accountability and the courage to tell the truth. I tried to hold the room steady with my voice. By the time I met the hiring manager, the day had softened into a haze. The manager's office had a shelf of books about leadership and a small framed photo of the CEO shaking hands with someone at a charity event. The manager asked insightful questions about strategy and measurement, and for a few minutes I felt like I was finally in the conversation I had hoped for. Then came a pivot. There was talk of clients who expected a certain presence, who liked things a particular way. The phrase "a certain look" hovered, not quite spoken, but thick in the air. I heard it without hearing it, and I answered by naming the universal qualities that build trust: reliability, clarity, respect. We wrapped with the usual lines. "Great to meet you. We will be in touch soon." The handshake was firmer this time, almost as if an apology. I stepped back into the corridor and watched employees drift by, laughing in a way that suggested belonging. The elevator carried me down through the floors, my reflection in the mirrored doors looking composed and unfamiliar all at once. Outside, the city felt brighter than the lobby. I sat for a moment on a low wall and let the afternoon sun find my face. I replayed the questions, the glances, the words that had meant one thing and also another. I could not tell if the heaviness in my chest was disappointment or just the residue of being measured by a scale that had nothing to do with ability. But beneath it was still a thread of hope. I had done the work. I had shown up with care and skill. I had felt a small friction in the room, but I had also seen a few eyes light up when I spoke. Hope is stubborn that way. It sits beside you even when you are not sure if it should. When my phone buzzed with a "thank you for coming" message, I smiled despite myself. I told the friend who had called that morning that it went well, mostly, and that I was hopeful. I wanted that to be true. I stood and smoothed the front of my suit. The glass tower behind me caught the sun and threw it back to the street, and I walked away feeling both seen and somehow invisible, buoyed and bruised in equal measure. I chose to hold on to the part that shimmered. The email landed in my inbox with the same neutral thud as a shipping confirmation or a receipt. The subject line was clean and polite. The first sentence was grateful. The second sentence was regretful. It was the rhythm I had come to recognize, a song of careful language that said very little and took much away. "We appreciate your time. We value your experience. We have decided to move forward with other candidates." My eyes kept returning to the words as if the meaning might shift into something else if I stared long enough. I sat still for a while, the brightness of the screen making the room look dimmer. My jacket, still warm from the interview, hung on the back of the chair like another person in the room. I could still see the conference table, the glass walls, the framed awards that spelled out excellence without ever saying what kind. I reminded myself of the handshake, the laugh at the story about the project I had led, the nod when I described the strategy I had brought to a team that was behind on every deadline. Their eyes had followed the slide deck. Their pens had paused when I paused. It had felt like belonging. I replied to the email with a short thank you and a request for feedback. My fingers hovered, then tapped send. The silence that followed was heavy, but I tried to settle into it. I made tea. I counted my breaths without counting them. I told myself what I always told myself. You are qualified, you prepared, there will be another chance. My phone rang. Unknown number. I stared at it for a heartbeat too long. Then I swiped to answer and said hello, steady, as if I had spent the whole day expecting good news. The voice on the other end introduced a title, then an apology for the timing, and then said it was about the process. I could hear a printer in the background. I could hear that they were calling from a desk. The voice said they wanted to follow up personally. It was kind in the way that suggests distance. I thanked them for calling and asked if there was anything I could do better next time. There was a pause. It stretched. The voice lowered, as if speaking to me from another room, and said, "You are very impressive. The team thought so. Your background is strong. It is just a matter of fit. Words that have been smoothed in with use." I waited. The voice added something else, quicker, almost under the breath. "Some of our clients are more comfortable with a certain presence at the front of the room." I must have gone silent for long enough to frighten them. because they began to fill the space with more words. They tried to put the sentence back in the box. They said it was complicated and that it was not about qualifications and that the company values inclusion. The word inclusion felt like a decor piece, shiny and dusted weekly. I heard another sentence slip out, the one that changed the air in the room. We have to think about how clients respond, and they can be particular about look and sound. It is not personal. The phrase "not personal" fell between us like a cracked plate. I heard my own voice from far away, calm and even. "Are you saying," I asked, "that my race influenced the decision?" The voice stumbled. "I did not say that," they replied, too fast, too eager to unwind what had already been said. There was a scuffle of papers, a promise to follow up. The call ended with the careful politeness that had begun it. I put the phone down on the desk and listened to the quiet. The skin on my arms prickled. I could feel my heartbeat in my mouth, my neck, my wrists. Part of me wanted to crawl under a blanket and let the day wash over me and away. Another part sat up straighter. The part that had carried me into every room that seemed to ask for permission I did not need. The part that had watched subtle signals and learned to translate them. The part that understood that sometimes something is only clear when someone says it out loud. I opened a blank document and typed everything I could remember, even the size of the pause before certain words, even the sound of the printer. I copied the email into a separate folder. I forwarded it to my personal account. I wrote down the time of the call and what I had asked and what they had said. I wrote those words exactly as I remembered them. I read it over and added the way my stomach dropped when they said presence. I added how the office smelled like lemon and toner when I was there. I added the way one of the interviewers had smiled too widely when asking about how I handle challenging clients. I recorded the questions that seemed out of place, the curious way they lingered on where I grew up and how I learned to speak so clearly. None of it is proof alone, I told myself, but braided together, it is a story that holds. I called someone I trust, someone who had sat on the other side of these decisions and had fought to make them fairer. I described the email, the call, the exact phrases. There was a long silence on the line, the kind of silence that says, "I am listening." Then I heard the words I needed. Document it. Follow up in writing. Ask them to confirm what you heard. Make the record. Do not let them hide behind fog. I opened a new email. "Hello," I wrote. "Thank you for your call today. I want to confirm my understanding of our conversation. You shared that although my qualifications were strong, the decision included concerns about client comfort with my presence, including factors related to my race. Please let me know if this is accurate." I read it once, twice. I removed anything that sounded like accusation and left only what was said, what I heard, what needed to be acknowledged. I copied the general hiring inbox listed on the website. My finger hung above the trackpad. I felt the same mix of fear and steadiness I feel before a big presentation when the first slide is about to glow and there is no turning back. I pressed send. I closed my laptop and stood by the window. The city outside looked the same as it had that morning, but it felt different now, tilted, full of eyes. I thought about every time I had told myself to keep it moving, to let it go, to be grateful for the next thing. I thought about how it would be easier to shrink. Then I thought about who watches me, who measures what is possible by what I do and what I refuse to accept. I thought about my younger self, holding a book about people who had stood up when it was hard and thinking, I want to be that brave. My phone buzzed with messages from friends asking how it went. I typed and erased and typed again. It went like it always goes, I wrote. But this time they said the quiet part. I am not going to let it slide. I saved my notes in a place I could find in the dark. I looked up the number of a local legal clinic. I wrote a list of questions for when I called. I breathed in and out until my pulse stopped pounding in my ears. The email sat out there in someone else's inbox, a spark looking for dry kindling. I did not know who would read it first. I did not know what it would set alight. What I knew was this. The story was no longer only mine, held inside my chest where it could smother me. It was on paper. It was in the world. And I was ready to see where it would go. The cursor blinked in the middle of the rejection note, a neat little paragraph apologizing for the inconvenience of my time and explaining the elusive culture fit. It read like an apology, written to no one in particular, careful and clean, empty as an unfurnished room. I scrolled up to reread my own messages, looking for a thread I could pull. In the forwarded history was the first loose stitch. There was a line that was never meant for my eyes, a half sentence about client comfort and whether my background would be distracting in certain rooms. It sat there quietly, almost shy, until anger gave it shape. A friend inside the company had already warned me there were comments in the hiring channel after my interview, not the kind you could refute with a certification or a glowing reference from a past manager. Not the kind you can fix with a different shirt. They blurred names and sent me a screenshot anyway, knowing the risk. The language was careful, coded enough to pass in daylight, but the meaning was obvious. Words like polish and optics and the kind of voice they wanted at the table. My face heated as I read it. It had the texture of something I already knew, only now it had proof. I put everything in order on my laptop. The timeline went into a document. I added screenshots, the email thread, the voicemail where the recruiter's tone shifted from bright to brittle. I added a short note about what the interviewers had asked and what they had not asked. I wrote plainly about being Black and how that fact had been made to carry a weight it did not deserve. Then I rewrote it, stripping out heat until only the facts remained. I read it aloud, listened to my own voice, then attached the files and wrote to Human Resources. The first reply came quickly, all warmth and policy. They were committed to fairness. They took concerns seriously. They would look into it. The message smiled without showing teeth. I sat on my hands and waited, eager and wary. A day went by, then another. No one called. I drafted a follow-up and deleted it, then sent it anyway. The response, when it came, suggested a call at a time that slid around my calendar like a wet glass on a table. When we finally connected, the conversation was heavy with commiseration and light on substance. I was thanked for my courage. There were questions about what I wanted. There were assurances that the company valued diversity. When I asked about the decision itself, the answer toggled between vague process notes and the refrain that all decisions were final. The hiring team never reached out. What I heard instead, through that quiet network of employees who still believed the place could be better, was that the role had been reposted with the title change and the description rearranged like a couch moved to the other wall. When I asked Human Resources about that, the reply was that shifts in business needs were common. When I asked if my screenshots would be reviewed, they asked for the names blurred out. My friend had taken a risk already. I would not make them spell it in front of a firing squad. I kept my tone measured. I wrote to the person above the person I had been speaking with. Everything in me wanted to shout, to make it impossible to look away. I did not want to be dismissed as angry and therefore unbelievable. I made my words simple and heavy. Then came another pause that swelled like a bruise. My inbox stayed quiet. My phone did not ring. I imagined my packet of evidence sitting in a queue somewhere between automated recaps and vacation requests. There are moments when you realize the polite avenue is a cul-de-sac. You can keep circling and keep waving and you will still be in the same place. The company website had a link at the bottom for an ethics line managed by a third party, the kind of place you use when you cannot trust anyone you can see. I opened the portal and chose the category for discrimination and harassment, then filled out every field. I uploaded everything. I described what had been said, how it had been said, who was present when it was said. I explained why I could not unblur my friend's name and why that did not make the evidence less true. I added a note that they could reach me directly, that I was not anonymous, that I would stand behind every sentence I had written. That same evening, I wrote another letter. This one was not to a system. It was to a person whose title sat at the very peak of the company's org chart. I did not know the direct address, but the pattern for emails was not hard to find. I guessed and wrote a subject line that would not get lost in the wide, white noise of an executive inbox. I told the story again, in my own voice, not as a legal claim or a demand, but as a record. I said what had happened, what I had been told, what I had seen, how it felt to be praised for my experience until my face walked in the room. I wrote that the company bore a set of values printed on lobby walls and glossy posters, and that I was asking whether those words could still do any work. I did not expect an answer. I have learned not to build a house where hope lives. I hit send, then printed the letter and the supporting pages and put them in an envelope addressed to the office of the chief executive, adding a line for attention to the assistant I found listed in a press release. The next morning, I walked to the courier drop and passed the envelope through the slot. It felt like dropping a pebble into a well and waiting for a sound that might never come. Silence stretched again, but this time it had an undercurrent, like air right before a storm. The ethics portal confirmed receipt with an impersonal reference code. My letter to Human Resources sat unanswered. In my mind, I rearranged the scene of every meeting I had sat in, every waiting room chair, every glass conference room where my reflection doubled and doubled until it was all I could see. On a gray afternoon, while I was stirring a pot of rice that had just begun to stick, my phone buzzed on the counter. The sender was an unfamiliar address ending with the company's domain and a subject line that made my mouth go dry. The office of the chief executive was requesting a time to speak. There was no defensiveness in the language, no caution tape wrapped around the request. They referenced the letter I had sent and the documents I had uploaded to the ethics line. They had read it. It had made its way past filters and buffer zones and the careful choreography of corporate distance. Later, I would learn that the ethics vendor had flagged my submission for escalation, a term that hardly covers the feeling of a story finally hitting a vein. The assistant who handled sensitive correspondence had matched the portal report with my email and put both on the desk that was never supposed to see a message like mine. Some generosity lived in that choice, some belief that the truth belongs at the top when it cannot find a foothold anywhere else. I stood over the stove while the rice began to turn, and I did not stir it. I let the email sit on the screen, the words crisp and steady, and I felt something unspool at the base of my throat. The truth had flown over the heads that would not look down. It had found a way to be seen. The message from the CEO arrived before sunrise, a simple note asking if we could talk. I had sent my complaint the night before, a last attempt to let someone higher up know what had happened in that interview room. I expected a form response. Instead, the CEO called, voice steady, no defensiveness, no corporate gloss. I am sorry, the CEO said, not for the optics, not for the discomfort, but for the harm. I want to get this right. I want to listen. Will you tell me everything, and will you allow me to act on it? I heard the words as if from a distance. The rejection had felt like a familiar bruise, and my instinct was to brace for evasions and legal phrasing. I told the story. I told it with the pauses and the hesitations that appeared when I reached the parts that made me feel small, the questions about whether I would fit, the long silence when I brought up my work, the final brush-off delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that settles in your chest and tries to make a home. The CEO did not interrupt. When I finished, there was a long quiet and then a clear outline of what would happen next. The hiring manager and recruiter would be placed on leave while a formal investigation began. An external firm would conduct interviews and review communications. Every step would be documented, and I would receive regular updates. The CEO asked for my permission to share my account with the investigators and offered to connect me with a support person so I would not have to keep retelling it alone. More than anything, the CEO promised transparency, not in a vague way, but as a commitment I could hold them to. By midday, a message went out to the entire company. There was no euphemism. An incident had occurred in the hiring process that ran counter to the values printed on the walls and sold to the world. The CEO acknowledged that the harm was racial, named it directly, and apologized to me and to every Black employee and candidate who had ever been asked to carry the weight of someone else's bias. There would be a full investigation by an independent team. Findings would be shared with staff. Consequences would follow those findings. Questions were invited, and the CEO promised to stand there and receive them. The investigators worked quickly. They spoke with people who had been on the interview panels, with coordinators, with members of the team who had seen messages that had not aged well. They pulled calendars and chat logs. I told my story again in a room that felt both clinical and humane, watched by someone whose only job was to ensure I did not have to decide alone when enough was enough. I felt my throat catch when I had to repeat the exact words that had been said to me. The investigator pressed gently where needed. I left that room with the familiar ache of being asked to prove my own experience, but I also left with the sense that a record had been made and that it would not be easily erased. A week later, the CEO stood in front of the company and delivered the findings. Language had been used during interviews that revealed unfair assumptions about Black candidates. The hiring process had been inconsistent and selectively applied. Several people who should have escalated concerns chose not to. The words landed across the room like the first real light after a storm. Then came the part that mattered just as much. The hiring manager was dismissed. The recruiter was reassigned and placed on a corrective plan while the company restructured the recruiting team. Panelists who had participated in biased exchanges were disciplined and removed from interviewing until they completed training overseen by an external partner. The CEO did not hide behind vague terms. Each action was described plainly, and there was a clear explanation of why it was taken. There was also a commitment to notify the board and include the board in continued oversight. Policy changes did not arrive as a glossy list on a slide. They came as a reordering of how the company would treat people. Resumes would be anonymized in the first pass. Interview questions would be standardized, with rubrics designed to measure skills rather than a hazy sense of fit. Every panel would be balanced in composition, and a trained observer would be present to intervene if the process veered off course. Informal referrals would no longer fast-track candidates. A reporting channel would be created outside of the HR chain, staffed by people who were not beholden to anyone who might be implicated. Leadership incentives would be tied to inclusive hiring practices that could be measured and audited. The CEO promised to publish a summary of these changes on the public site and to invite feedback from employees and candidates alike. After the meeting, the CEO asked to see me. The office was quieter than I expected. The CEO apologized again, this time in a way that made it clear the apology was an action, not a shield. I was told that whether or not I chose to continue pursuing the role, my experience would not be used as a badge for the company to wear. The CEO asked what repair might look like from my perspective. I told the truth. Repair would look like not having to answer a question about whether I belonged. It would look like other Black candidates never having to rely on a complaint and a miracle to receive fair treatment. It would look like the company learning to see what had been there the whole time. An invitation was extended to re-enter the hiring process with a new panel and an independent observer present from start to finish. I asked for time. The CEO did not push. Instead, the CEO asked if it would help to speak with current employees who had advocated for change and volunteered to serve on the new panels. I said yes. I spoke with people across teams who admitted they had seen things and had not always known how to speak up. I heard relief in their voices that someone at the top had finally said aloud what had lingered in hushed conversations. The public stand came next. The CEO published a letter that named the problem without naming me, took responsibility for the culture that had allowed it, and laid out the steps being taken. Community groups were invited to review the new hiring process and offer critiques. The company pledged to invest in training developed by organizations that understood the terrain, not just a quick seminar with a certificate. Comments poured in. Some praised, some challenged, some told their own stories. The CEO answered with patience and clarity, and when the company fell short, it was said aloud, not spun. Inside the company, the air shifted. People began sharing their experiences at open forums, and not all of those stories were easy to hear. The CEO sat in the front row and listened. Managers attended sessions where they practiced naming bias and interrupting it. Recruiters learned to pause when they felt the urge to use the word fit. Teams rewrote job descriptions to focus on what the role actually required. The company sunsetted internal chat groups that had become places where cynicism festered and set up moderated spaces where concerns could be raised without retaliation. Transparency became a habit. Each month, the company sent an update on hiring outcomes and what had been learned from the new process. When something did not work, the message said so and explained what would change. A summary of the investigation and the actions taken was posted where anyone could read it. Names were not published, but accountability was not hidden. I watched it all with a heart that was cautious but open. I had read too many statements that did not change anything. This felt different, not because it was perfect, but because the company kept choosing to step into discomfort rather than away from it. When I finally sat again for an interview, the room felt different. No one asked me to prove that I belonged in my own work. They asked about my approach, my ideas, how I handled disagreement, what I would build in the first season. An observer sat quietly, and I saw them make notes when someone veered into a question that had not been agreed upon. The panel corrected itself. We moved on. In the end, what mattered more than any job was the fact that a door had been opened that would not close behind me. The CEO's apology was not a period. It was a beginning. The investigation drew a line. The consequences told the truth about values. The policy changes reshaped the bones of the place. The public stand made it clear that the company understood that fairness is not a secret internal memo. It is a promise you make where everyone can see it and then keep again and again. When the message came from the top office, I read it 3 times before I could breathe right. There was an apology, a request to talk, and a promise that what happened to me would be addressed. The words looked neat on the screen, but my stomach still knotted with the memory of being told I did not fit, of watching a door close that I knew I had earned the right to walk through. It is a strange thing when the person with the most power in a building finally sees you. You feel seen, and you feel tired all at once. In the meeting, I laid everything out. I described the interview that turned icy after small talk drifted to who I am and where I am from. I described the sudden shift from discussing strategy to vague concerns about culture. I told them about the way the silence after the final call felt like a verdict I had felt too many times before. The person at the head of the table listened. No quick fixes, no cheap lines about fit, an apology again, this time without qualifiers, and a commitment to do more than whisper about change. An offer was placed back on the table with better terms than before. I could hear the pitch that would make sense to a lot of people. Take the role, come in as a change maker, show that the company could grow. I could see a version of that future. I could also see what it would cost me to be the lesson inside their building. I had not come to that table empty-handed. From the moment I felt the interview's turn, I had started writing it all down. Dates, times, who was on the calls, what was said. Every email went into a folder. I sent myself summaries after conversations, because memory needs receipts when you are the only witness. I talked to people I trust outside the company and asked for guidance. I reached out to a civil rights clinic and learned what the words in the law actually mean for a person like me trying to get a job. I learned I had the right to be considered without bias, the right to ask questions about process and pay, the right to report what happened without being punished for telling the truth. I learned which public agencies take complaints about hiring discrimination and how to file with them if I chose to do that. I learned to keep everything in writing, to ask for confirmations, to put my questions in emails so that silence had to sit next to them. I told the people in that room that if I accepted, I would need more than a title and a check. I would need to see policies change in ways that outlasted anyone's good intentions. I asked for blind resume reviews, for early screens, for interview panels that reflected the communities the company serves, for hiring rubrics that score skills instead of gut feelings about culture. I asked for transparency in pay bands, for clear promotion criteria, for a way to report bias that did not send complaints into a black hole. I asked that the people involved in my interview be held to account, not shamed, but required to learn, to be measured, to change. I asked that the company publish what they would do, not as a brag, but as a promise we could all read. The person at the head of the table did not argue. There was a plan described: audits by a firm that does not answer to the company, training that is more than a slideshow, hiring managers tied to measurable goals, an open line for anyone to speak up, not to a friend of a friend, but to someone with the authority to act. It sounded like movement. It also sounded like a lot for me to carry on my first day. So I sat with it. I went home, closed my laptop, and listened to the part of me that has always had to know when to fight from within and when to build somewhere else. I thought about how often people like me are asked to be grateful for doors that should have opened without a fight. I thought about future meetings where my presence would be used to certify that the company is better now. I thought about the young people who might come after me and whether my choice could clear a little of the fog they are forced to walk through. In the end, I wrote back, with respect and with clarity, I would not be accepting the role. I wanted the company to keep its promises anyway, to fix the process for the next person who should not have to be a story just to get a fair shot. I thanked them for the apology and told them that accountability is love in a place like that. The response came quickly. They said they understood. They would move forward with the changes. I saved that message with the others. I found another path. In interviews after that, I asked direct questions about how decisions are made. I asked where pay bands live and who can see them. I asked who sits on panels and how they are chosen. I asked for everything in writing. I kept doing what saved me the first time. I wrote things down. I reported concerns when they showed up. I leaned on the rights I had learned and the community that taught me to use them. If you are reading this because you have felt that same knot in your stomach, know this. You are not wrong for noticing. Write it all down, even the small moments that feel easy to forget. Ask for communication in writing and keep copies of what you send and what you receive. Find out which agency in your area handles discrimination in hiring and learn how to speak to them. Talk to a lawyer or a clinic if you can. even just for a consult. Share your experience with people you trust at work and outside it, because isolation is a strategy that protects the status quo. Advocate for yourself in every room you enter. Ask about pay transparency and evaluation criteria. If a process feels off, say so and follow up in writing. If you are comfortable, report what happened through the channels that exist and ask what steps will be taken. If retaliation shows up, document that too. Protect your peace. Know when to push. Know when to walk. Real allyship in a company does not live in statements. It lives in leaders who put their names on changes and accept the cost of those changes. It looks like managers who stop defending bias and start fixing systems. It looks like colleagues who intervene in the moment, who refuse to let harmful jokes slide, who decline to sit on homogenous panels, who share power and open doors without needing credit. It looks like HR that tracks patterns and acts on them. It looks like transparency that makes sunlight a daily practice, not a press release. As for me, I did not take the job that came back around. I took the dignity that comes from choosing myself, and I took the lessons that hard days teach. I hold space for the possibility that the company will become better because people there now have to answer to the truth. I hope the next time someone like me sits in their lobby, they walk into a room where their talent is the only thing being weighed. Until then, I will keep telling the story because stories teach and because somewhere, someone is measuring whether to stay quiet or to speak. If you choose to speak, I am already clapping for you.